Angry Birds, the iPhone game phenomenon created by Rovio, an active contender in the bet of who can be the biggest merchandising harlot with TMNT and Minions, has thrown its hat into the ring of video game movie adaptations because, hey, so far their best competition is a 2 highly rated horror game and a literal compilation of video game cutscenes. And Wreck-It Ralph would wreck the curve, so we're not gonna count it. Anyway, I was not super thrilled at the prospect of having to see it, especially when I witnessed its recent trailer featuring the birds spitting urine-tainted water into each other's mouths. And yet, at this point, I've grown accustomed to the pattern of animated movie trailers often revealing their, okay, in this case, not funniest, but often their most juvenile jokes to assure parents that this movie will make your kids laugh and totally not make them think too hard, even though the humor will never quite reach the peak of the trailer, and the movie actually likely will have some somber and even dark moments because everyone's trying to tell you that they've at least seen a Pixar movie, though at this point the standard has shifted to Disney, but parents will be totally fine with that as long as you advertise it like an upbeat spastic time waster. Remember that Tangled trailer and that scene that wasn't even in the movie? So assured that at the very least the movie couldn't get any worse than that scene, I went to the film and it was not awful. In fact, I was kind of enjoying myself, which was weird because it still had a lot of the superficial trappings I and others have pointed out in other lowest common denominator animated films. An overabundance of pop culture references, painfully inserted pop music, puns. It had all of that, and it wasn't really bothering me. And not because it was doing any of those things particularly better. Was it because I was expecting it to be so much worse? Have so many animated films made me numb to these patterns? Was it because there was at least minorly more character focus than the last video game movie I saw? First of all, while it's not anything groundbreaking, the animation does have to be commended for the excellent design in incorporating the cartoonish, simplistic, limbless designs of its game characters into a believable but still appropriately cartoony CG characters that can move at a brisk pace and are very expressive. There's a bit of good texture work in the feathers and in the background, not so much to make the characters seem out of place, because the main focus is to keep the original imagery and aesthetic from the game it was based on. Why has this been so difficult? Well, technology among other things. But honestly, one of the biggest reasons I was enjoying this was for the dialogue. I mean, not that this is any sort of pedestal of impeccable wit, but to touch on a subject that I'm sure I've never brought up before. But one of my biggest pet peeves in animated films is the use of way too much kitschy modern vernacular. And if I said this movie avoided that entirely, I'd be lying, but no one says best blank ever. No one makes jokes about smartphones or texting, and no one says awesome 500 times! I mean, it still has puns, but you know what? I'll take it. Pluck my life? Sure, fine. Just please don't make anybody say hashtag. I also can't help but feel at least a little bit of kinship with the main character Red as he's confronted with a series of relatable everyday grievances, especially dealing with difficult customers. I think it does a decent job of making people understand his frustration, even though you acknowledge that he is overreacting to a situation when he loses his temper. And then of course him being surrounded by a bunch of smiling, cheerful morons who dare to call him out for being in a bad mood because we don't take kindly to frowny faces in Flatless Bird Town. Realistically, they're not out of line considering his actions, but I feel his pain. Facing the happy bird sign is one of the most relatably hilarious things I've seen all year. And yeah, I can already hear you thinking, oh wow, Sally hates happy characters? Well, this is a surprise to nobody. Which, by the way, guys, is not true. Yes, perpetually positive, high-energy goofballs tend not to be my personal favorite types of characters, because my favorite type is snarky, intelligent badasses. But there are always exceptions, because Mabel is one, and Chuck is another, because he just is the best part of the film. And I am not an Olaf worshiper by any stretch, though he is another exception, and it would be so easy to just write this character off as Olaf on speed, literally, as he apparently possesses the powers of Quicksilver. And there's not an obviously parodied scene of that anywhere in this movie. No, of course not. Gee, wouldn't that be embarrassing if that turned out to be the best Quicksilver scene in theaters this month? But he also just happens to be the most fun and genuinely nice character out of anyone. He's also the most recent addition of thinly implied homosexual cartoon characters that aren't villains, because it's never too early to teach kids that it's okay if you're gay, as long as you don't actually tell anyone. But yeah, overall, I was enjoying this. Until the pigs showed up. And suddenly the movie shifts into a careening downward spiral. Slowly at first, because Red still has some good lines, and Bill Hader's King Leonard is decent as the world's most obvious hustler. Heck, it's still leg up on most of Illumination's villains. But the other pigs' main contribution to the movie is to jack up the number of useless references and wave their butts in your face. Not to allude that this didn't happen a few times before the pigs showed up, but there is a noticeable turn, is what I'm saying here. But the real downturn is the plot cul-de-sac where the three main birds go to see Mighty Eagle, where it shows the two sidekicks for the first time being truly needlessly obnoxious because road trip gag. And then the great Peter Dinklage Eagle pretty much just burns time for 10 minutes with lackluster jokes that refuse to end. And of course, the segment includes the mentioned urine lake scene. This entire bit and this character did not need to be in this movie whatsoever. And then the final act, okay, remember when I talked about Home and it felt like somebody went in at the last minute and messed around with the editing? Well, apparently we have a rogue animation editing menace, but he has struck again. When the birds finally get to the slingshot and start breaking the pig's kingdom, which is not a spoiler because it's the entire point of the game and also in the trailer, but then again, so is the entire movie, so we are beyond spoilers at this point. But again, it feels like the entire scene is being played on fast forward. Despite the fact that we are looking at massive building destruction, warplanes, and magical slingshot bird bullets, because the shots and cuts are coming so quickly and at such a predictable rhythm, the scene becomes hypnotically boring. I can assume the two first-time directors that have worked on good animated films before thought that they could keep the momentum running and the tension high if they didn't allow the audience to catch their breath for even a second. But tension is supposed to rise and fall. That's what makes it a roller coaster. This is just sitting at the top of the Tower of Terror for 10 minutes. Suspenseful at first, but eventually you realize that the ride is broken. It was also probably affected by the preceding usual pre-climax emotional low point where everyone is way too fast to apologize and hail Red for the true Nostradamus he is. Because in the end, this story is about a town of blissful happy idiots welcoming a crew of immigrants without question who then wreck the place and steal their children. And turns out the only intelligent foreseeing soul in this sea of dim-witted sheep was the impulsive angry one who says that the answer all along was just to get angry and bomb the ever-loving hell out of the enemy. Oh lordy lordy, turns out Donald Trump was right all along. And yes, I'm sure I'm the only one who has made this observation. This includes the bird culture being portrayed as a blatant stereotype of what conservatives think liberal PC culture is like. A sea of perpetually fake-smiling idiots who have become so complacent and lazy in their collectivist lifestyle that they've forgotten how to fly, who shame and dismiss anyone who mentions anything even mildly unpleasant. Which is weird, considering this is exactly what ideal conservatism looked like in the 50s. And even then, I always take messages in a single children's story with a grain of salt because I know the real effectiveness of a message is how often it's repeated, so I tend to take more issue with reoccurring tropes. But seriously, you're telling Americans the thing they need is to get more angry about stuff? And I know, a lot of this was locked in by the nature of the game it was based on. And how exactly would you react if somebody stole your kid and was planning to eat it? But if that really was the case, I don't think that bombing would be the smartest idea. So in the end, no, it's not a very good movie. But I also can't hate on it as much as everyone else is. I wasn't lying when I said I was initially enjoying this. I still commend it for its animation, some of its dialogue, a few of its characters, paying homage to the game it was based on, and a decent voice cast. Sure, this is the bare minimum a theatrical animation should be able to do, in theory, but there's... Wait, who is Sean Penn in this? That guy? He didn't even talk! He just grunted! What? Oh my god, I hate the system. But honestly, even if everything here was executed flawlessly, no one expected this to be any sort of masterpiece. This was only ever going to be a silly little time waster. But there's nothing wrong with that. Like every other form of comedy, it can be done well, and it can be too dumb to function. And it being a commercial tie-in doesn't mean anything because we've seen that those don't have to suck. But even on its comedy, the one thing that could have eclipsed all of the other problems, what it had with Red's pessimism and Chuck's zaniness was drowned out by crude lowbrow humor and references and not supported enough by a story that honestly could have worked better. There were moments that supported that Red's unhappiness was just as much of a result of his own bad decisions as they were being annoyed at stupid people. This could have been more introspective, heck, even if they had taken the political allegory more seriously. And I swore they were gonna go somewhere with that whole orphan background they kept bringing up. There was material here to give the story just a little bit more substance. And it's not because they didn't have time, what with your giant pissing eagle padding and your last-minute plugged-in moral to weakly justify it. But all of it still could have been saved if it was at least funny, but not enough. So yeah, I put way too much effort into this movie, and mine will probably be the most positive review you'll see outside of crazy people. And even I'm not telling you to go see it. Everything it does well has been done better in other movies, and there is just not enough here that I think is worth an older viewer paying $10 for, especially when arguably the funniest scene is Chuck getting his speeding ticket, and you can watch that on YouTube right now. But I still give it credit where I think it's due, and by far cannot be considered the worst thing to happen to animation this year. Still, from where I'm sitting, Finding Dory cannot get here fast enough. Recommendation level 2.3 out of 5.